Hi, Tom Heyman here with the Real Estate Negotiation Institute, bringing you another expert tip. Today, we're going to talk about how sellers can provide meaningful information to the buyer's side in a multiple offer situation. Oftentimes, all the buyer's side hears is highest and best, and they have no idea what best is for the seller. It's in the seller's self-interest to be as precise as possible with regard to what's important to them, what their preferences are, what their minimums might be, the areas they really want the buyer to focus on. So let's talk about how the seller can do this in a way that doesn't limit the buyer's ability to provide maximum value. Let's start with financials and price. Price is typically the most important factor in a multiple offer situation, but not always. And conventional wisdom is that the higher the price, the better the offer. However, the higher the price, the more the appraisal might become an issue. So for the seller's benefit, the buyer should include appraisal gap protection, and the seller could signal to the buyer something like, buyer should consider appraisal gap protection as appropriate with their offer, meaning the higher the offer price, the higher the gap protection should be as well. Closing cost support. In a strong buyer's market, it's very normal for the buyer to ask the seller to pay some of the closing costs. Turn that around in a strong seller's market, the seller could indicate to the buyer that their offer would be more attractive if they were agreeing to pay some of the seller's closing costs. And this has potentially two benefits. Here's why. Let's take a scenario where the seller is asking $400,000 for their house. The buyer wants to offer $420,000. The $420,000 price might not make the appraisal, and that could be an issue. So if the buyer instead offered a price of $410,000 and $10,000 in closing cost support, then that's the equivalent of a $420,000 offer in general. And it A, reduces the risk of the appraisal with a $410,000 price, and B, the seller does not pay commission on those closing costs that are paid by the buyer. If the seller has personal property that they'd like to sell, it's either included with the listing offering, or the seller could indicate that there's other personal property that's available on the side. And timing, let's look at closing date, closing period. That usually is very important to the seller. If the seller wants a shorter closing period or a longer closing period, that should be communicated up front so the buyer knows that they can take whatever steps are necessary to accommodate what the seller really wants. And associated with the shorter closing period is the due diligence period, where the buyer has to do all their inspections and potentially negotiate any repairs. If the buyer knows that up front, that the shorter closing period is desired, then they can start taking steps right away to meet that for the seller. In the area of protection, there are several areas that the seller would like maximum protection or more protection than not, that would reduce the risk of dealing with any particular buyer. So one of those is the earnest deposit. The seller could signal that they would prefer a high earnest deposit that is non-refundable, either all or partly by some date. That gives the seller more protection, less risk with that buyer, especially if the buyer defaults or breaches the purchase contract. The appraisal gap protection, as I mentioned before, is an area that the buyer should give appropriately, depending on the offer price that they're giving the seller. Post-close occupancy is another area that the seller could definitely want or might want. So if they signaled up front that an offer that offered post-closing occupancy option would be favorably viewed, then the buyer could consider that, and if necessary, take whatever steps they have to make that possible for the seller. And lastly, the buyer loan status. If the buyer is an all cash buyer, then the seller doesn't have to worry about the buyer qualifying for a loan because there is none. If the buyer is taking a loan and they are fully approved through underwriting, there's less risk for the seller. If the buyer is taking a loan and they're just pre-qualified, then there's a higher risk for the seller in terms of the buyer not being able to potentially get approved for their loan. So if the buyer is just pre-qualified, they should provide additional information if they can to reduce the risk for the seller. The seller could signal in the guidelines that they give to the buyers that pre-approved status is preferred over pre-qualified. So I hope the listing side will be able to give more guidance to the buyer side. It's in their self-interest, and the seller will get a better offer from the buyers the first time. We hope this has been beneficial for you, and we look forward to bringing you more expert tips on our YouTube channel. Thank you.